Um, Let me welcome all of you to the distinguished plenary lecture to be delivered by Professor Arvind Panagaria, Vice Chairman, Niti Aayog. Today he will be speaking on the topic is Indian economy, retrospect and prospect. Now, Professor Panagaria took over as Vice Chairman Niti Aayog in January 2015, only few months back. Now, we have read so much about him in the newspapers that probably he needs no introduction. However, I know that there are many youngsters who have come from all over South Asia, and therefore, I will take the liberty to briefly introduce him, speak little bit about his bio. Uh, Professor Panagaria was born in 1952 and got his university education from Rajasthan University. After completing his master's in economics in 1973, he went to Princeton University for his PhD. After his PhD, he joined University of Maryland at College Park as an assistant professor in 1978 and eventually got elevated to a full professor in 1989. So 78 to 2004, he has been at University of Maryland at College Park, 26 years. Of course, in between, he has been moving around to various places. And in fact, there is one association we have. Some of my students from Delhi School, they have gone on to do PhD on the Orbians at Maryland. So in 2004, he moved to Columbia University as professor of economics and Jagdish Bhagwati professor of political economy, which he holds currently also. I guess he will be on leave from that position to take over as the vice chairman, Niti Aayog. Now, before moving to Columbia University, he has been chief economist of Asian Development Bank, has also worked for the IMF, World Bank, UNCTAD, and he edits a very well-known journal, India Policy Forum, which is published jointly by Brookings Institution and NCAER. Professor Panagaria has published more than 100 research papers in referred journals and has 13 books to his credit. He is well known for his pro-market views, I'll put it that way, and has publicly vouched for growth-oriented policies. His earlier book, India, the Emerging Giant, has been one of the best sellers. Some of his recent books, co-authored with Professor Jagdish Bhagwati, include India's Tryst with Destiny and Why Growth Matters. Now, these books have also been extremely popular. We are really thankful that he has been able to come today to deliver this special lecture in our first international conference that we are organizing in memory of Professor G.K. Chadha. In fact, he had agreed to come here in January. He wrote me a mail from Colombia that he is coming to India, and our invitation was standing. He had agreed to give a distinguished lecture here in our distinguished lecture series, and he wrote to me that he is coming and he can come around 10th of 11th of January, something like that. But that more or less coincided with his appointment with the Niti Aayog. So he wrote me the last mail, hold the announcement. I knew that he is coming as Niti Aayog vice chairman, and we'll catch him some other day. We are really glad and we are really thankful and grateful that he has been able to come here today on this special occasion when we are having the first international conference organized by the Faculty of Economics. I may also add this little bit. John is sitting here. John has spoken this morning. Dr. Manmohan Singh inaugurated the conference. It's a brilliant talk given by John, and we all know that John and Arvind probably their views are opposite. And I must add that this is a unique privilege to have both of them speak at the same conference. And I'm glad that being at South Asian University, I have been able to do it. This is a unique event. And we must thank both of them and enjoy their respective lectures. Only thing I have been able to do is that put them apart, one in morning and the other one pre-dinner talk. So on behalf of South Asian University, I extend a warm welcome to Arvind. And I would like my student, Sorbi, to greet him with a bouquet. So, Arvind, it's your turn. I guess you can take some questions after a few questions. Oh, okay.
How many? How long?
Up to you.
No, up to me.
Okay.
You want dinner, don't you?
Oh, okay. I'll say about 35, 40 minutes. Is that all right?
No, it's good.
Yeah.
Good evening. Thank you, Santosh, Dr. Kavitar. It's a great pleasure, privilege to be here. More or less, Santosh, you said I was to speak around 9th, 10th January, and then I couldn't. I think you're still getting more or less the first lecture. I have not gone out very much since coming to Niti. So, but I thought this was my familiar turf for a professor, and I hope that is how we can see each other. Jean has whetted your appetite, and I now fear that I'm going to be eaten alive here as a result of the appetite. We are on the opposite spectrum in one sense, but on another sense, we are on the same side, because at the end of the day, the objective is to combat poverty. So it is just an issue of instrumentality, that instruments that we seek are different. So that's really the main difference. Let me just start out, I started my career, as Santosh has described, after PhD in 1978. And much of, earlier periods, mainly the 1980s is what I remember. Things were rather pessimistic at the time. And a little joke kind of captures it very nicely. We used to say in the 1980s, economists who work on India are divided into two categories. They're the optimists and they're the pessimists. And the pessimist says that things are so bad, I can't imagine them getting any worse. And the optimist says, but I can. Think about it. Think about it. But at the end of the day, things turned around. 1991 happened, and a different set of economic policies began to be adopted, and certainly there was a turnaround. But that's the kind of history that I want to trace, but I want to start back. I want to start really at the beginning, which is 1950. So this is where the economic development is kicked off. Objective, at least my own reading of the history is, you can go back to Nehru's discovery of India, where he describes how even back in the late 1930s there was a planning committee of the Congress Party which was appointed, and it then discussed the full roadmap of how the planning will be done once the country became independent. You'll see that he starts out that of course we couldn't think of all this in the absence of a clear objective, and the objective was unequivocally poverty reduction and poverty elimination. And then he actually even goes into various aspects of it, that how much cloth each individual must have, how much living space each individual should have, health, education, everything gets listed actually. So all aspects of poverty that we today think in terms of are all listed there in the Discovery of India. But then he says that, of course, incomes were simply too low. And so while redistribution seemed desirable, there was simply not enough money to be redistributed. And this was later kind of more dramatically put by Michael Kaleski, who visited India and joked to Jagdish Bhagwati, saying that Bhagwati, the problem of India is that there are too few exploiters and too many exploited. By which he meant that there are too many to whom to redistribute and too few from whom to redistribute, and therefore redistribution would really fall short. So the objective therefore was, and this runs through later on Pitambar Pant's perspective planning division, when it produced a 20-year plan. Again, this issue comes back that how should we be combating poverty, and then looks at the income distribution evidence, etc. It comes to the conclusion, and then it says that look, still unless the pie grows bigger, there is no easy way that you can. And it takes the view that for the because it's also at the time examines the income distribution across several countries, finds that the bottom 30% generally have a more or less unchanging share of income, and so they say that, well, therefore for the bulk of the population, growth really has to be the main instrument, and it adopts 7% growth as the objective, or as the instrument really to target poverty. But it says that look, now there is 20% of the population which is not going to, which is not a part of the mainstream, and therefore you got to do redistribution for this particular section of the population, and so redistribution was to play a role, but growth was to be the primarily the objective. Now, how does this reality unfold? So here is the dramatic way I like to describe a very kind of bird's eye view of the 60-year or 65-year history as it unfolds. If you start out 1951, if you just normalize and say that the per capita income in 1951 was about $1 per person, it wasn't $1. If you do purchasing power parity, etc., maybe it was more like at today's purchasing power parity, it is probably less than $1. But let's for normalization say if it was $1. 30 years later, in 1980, you come to about $1.50. So this is now we are thinking in constant terms. So you raise the income of $1 to $1.50. 1990, roughly you get to $2. 2000, you get roughly to $3. Today you are at about $6. So first 50 years you come through 1950 all the way to 2000, you have added $2 to per capita income, and since 2000 then you have added about $3. So within this short span of about 13-14 years, you have added actually 1.5 times to per capita income relative to what you added in the first 50 years. So it's a gigantic difference between what has happened in the last 1.5 decades versus what happened in the earlier prior 50 years. I remember actually when I left India in 1974, exactly almost about 41 years ago. And the last decade that I spent here, roughly 1965 to 1974, I saw no change actually. My recollection is simply that, and that shows up in the data. That was also the decade during which per capita income barely rose, maybe 3.4% a year. So that's hardly perceptible. This is also the period then, of course, now you start out extremely poor and then you grow extremely slowly. Not too much can change. Not too much did change. So if you look at poverty in the end, that was the objective of poverty reduction achieved. First 25 years you get, India does have at least reasonable data, so you can go back and, define some poverty line. We have used for that period generally the Lakdawala poverty line, and you can measure the levels, and what you see basically is, that good rains, poverty declines some, bad rains, poverty rises. But if you look at the trend over a 25-year period, roughly no change. I mean, if there is a change, it's, if anything, there is a change. It's a tiny bit upward trend, certainly not a downward trend. It's not a big surprise because income started low and they remained low. And again, the scope for redistribution, therefore, remained very, very limited. I think it's a post, you can talk about 1980s maybe, some changes did happen. Incomes did begin to rise, and per capita income growth rate kicked up from maybe 3.8% in the first 30 years to maybe about little depending on how you're what beginning point and end points you use, basically 5%, 5.5%. So some change did happen during this period. Then you get the 1990s, where it rises, per capita income growth rate rises maybe by another percentage point. But then the 2000s is when the real action happens. So you got 2003-4 to about 2011-12, growth rate was over 8%. That is not per capita, but the GDP growth rate. So per capita is a little between 6 and 7. So that is where, again, if you look back at the poverty reduction, you see a very rapidly declining poverty trend during this period. All of you know, I mean, I'm sure all of you know the controversies that go with the poverty lines, etc. So you can choose your different poverty lines. You can, take the Tendulkar poverty line, which is what I have used in most of the numbers. That's what the official Planning Commission approach had been. But you can, I've also done the calculations using 1.5 times the Tendulkar poverty line. You can also do it twice. I mean, I've gone up to twice the poverty certainly declines no matter which of these poverty lines you use. Once you get to 2 times the Tendulkar poverty line, then of course very large, vast proportion of the population starting in 1993-94 is poor, and then the decline is smaller, because you know it that you have set the bar way up there, where 80-85% of the people are being described, or the population is being defined as poor. And then the decline correspondingly, because there are not too many people at that level, and therefore even increase in growth is not going to kick up that many people, because people who are the truly poor are really way down, and they're not going to get up 2 times the Tendulkar poverty line and jump up. So, but there's clearly a significant decline in poverty, not as much as at Tendulkar line, or about 1.5 times. So there's no question poverty does decline during this period. You can then ask, how about the specific groups? You can do this calculation. So Indian data at least does separate out by the religion, by the caste. So you can look at the scheduled caste, scheduled tribes, and the general population, and you see a declining trend for all 3. Poverty declines the sharpest actually for the scheduled castes, and scheduled tribes also it declines a little bit faster. This is true for 2004-5 to 2011-12. So if you take 4-5 to 11-12, these dates I am picking because the thick national sample surveys are done for these years, 93-94, 4-5, and 11-12. I've left out a couple in between for reasons I will. For reasons it's not worthwhile going into right here. But what you see is 4-5 to 11-12. This is the period when the growth has been the fastest compared to all other periods, if you take 93-94 to 4-5. And it's a much shorter period actually than the 93-94 to 4-5, but the decline in poverty is significantly larger actually within this 6-7 year period relative to the previous 11-year period. And the poverty decline in the scheduled castes turns out to be the sharpest. Even the scheduled tribes, the percentage decline and percentage point decline in poverty is marginally higher than for the general population. But that's where you still see poverty levels staying quite high. They start quite high. They still remain quite high actually, even at the Tendulkar line. And that is of course not totally unexpected. The scheduled castes are all sort of, this part of the general population. So when the economy grows, they are sort of, at least in some rough sense, in the mainstream. But the scheduled tribes are completely left away. They're not connected. And if you look, scheduled tribes are also predominantly rural, where scheduled castes are more evenly spread out between rural and urban areas. So the kind of isolation in the case of scheduled tribes is a lot more, and that you see, therefore, that the poverty decline in the scheduled tribes, at least, is much less. Okay, so that's the rough kind of roadmap I described. Now, what happened? I mean, why is it that growth did not happen in the earlier period? Why did it ultimately begin to happen? And this is where this whole issue of the pro-market versus not so pro-market, etc., comes to it. I think that in the early years, our intentions were obviously quite right, and we started off quite well. And there was general consensus in the 1950s that planning was the way to go. So nobody really took seriously. There were some dissenting voices, but really, broadly speaking, there was not real opposition. Economists wanted it, the businessmen wanted it, and of course Nehru, who was the dominant figure at the time, wanted it. So planning was adopted, and it did start reasonably okay. I mean, you take the first half of the 20th century, the growth rate had been less than 1% a year, and the periods, Second World War period, etc., real incomes probably fell during that period. You do kick it up to about 4%, the GDP growth rate, which is decent. During this period, if you look at countries like South Korea and Taiwan, well, Taiwan actually was growing faster than, but if you look at South Korea, that was also about 50s, was around 4%, 4.5%. So India doesn't look terribly different from South Korea. South Korea, of course, changes track in the early 1960s, turns outward. India stays course. In fact, it goes further into this direction. Now, what was the policy regime? The policy, at least, if you read parts of Nehru's speeches, he starts out saying that, look, obviously we had to strive for self-sufficiency. That at the end of the day, having won our independence, we couldn't afford to be economically still dependent. And the way he puts it is that, if we still had to then depend to sell our goods abroad and to buy the goods we wanted abroad as well, then this was not true self-sufficiency. We were still not truly independent. So for him, really, independence constituted being self-sufficient in the sense of producing what we consumed. Now, once you put it that way, politically, of course, this is a lot of salience, but economically, that turns into a pretty serious disaster. Because now, when you say that you want to produce domestically what you want to consume, that translates into even at that very low level of income, when you should be specializing in goods, products in which you have a comparative advantage, you become highly diversified. So, even if you say you needed bicycles, you wanted to produce bicycles, well, bicycles require steel. So then you say, well, I can't depend on, for steel, I can't depend on the foreign countries to import from abroad. I've got to produce my own steel. That, of course, is not a commodity you might have comparative advantage at the time. And then, of course, machinery is required to produce bicycles also. So you say, well, I'm also going to produce I'm also going to produce machinery. So we went into this highly diversified basket of production, and that, of course, also brought with it all kinds of other policies with it. That now if you wanted to do heavy industry, you clearly needed large investments. You knew that the private sector did not have the capability to do investments in these very heavy industries. And so you turned back and said, well, okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave all these labor intensive, the products that can be done on small scale also, textiles and clothing being obviously the most important of those. I'll leave that to the private guys, but I would make sure that they don't use the scarce investable resources for investment in those sectors. because those can be done at a very low level of investment. And so, in effect, this small scale production kicks in here. That and then you bring, how do you implement that? You say, well, I'm going to require licensing. Anything that requires investment more than $100,000 worth in today's terminology, let's say, in today's dollar values, it was not even 100,000 at the time, but let's say 100,000. Anything that requires more than that, you got to take a license. And of course, I'm not going to give you a license for something like textiles and clothing. So that automatically falls into then small manufacturers, because large investment is simply not, license will simply not be given. Chemical industry became a priority at the time, and licenses were given relatively easily. And 1950s, the licensing system operated fine actually. I mean, you see, at least I have read the history, looked for it, you see no complaints being made that the licensing system is not working. This begins to clog up by 62, 63, 64. I mean, that's where the businessmen start complaining that the system is not working. You apply and it takes forever to get the license, and a lot of dissatisfaction. And you see during this period, lots of committees get set up to study how the licensing system could be improved. Well, okay, so this is one part of the story. The other, this accompanying factor that happened. So you got into the licensing for the domestic production, but also self-sufficiency ended up translating eventually. I mean, initially, at least in Nehru's conception, he was not protectionist in the sense that we define protectionism today. Nehru's conception was more that, look, we reorient the production basket to what we need for consumption. And so the licensing and those sorts of instruments were the ones that actually got deployed. 1950s, if you look, trade-wise, actually, economy is relatively open. Consumer goods imports were allowed. A lot of the user, the actual user conditions, etc., are a little later. You even have these retail importers who are not the actual users, but they are allowed to import products. So 1950s was not so. It's only after 1958 there is this crisis. There is a balance of payments crisis. The sterling balances that India had accumulated during the Second World War ran out. And that's when you then introduce this foreign exchange budgeting. And this was a decision of a of a finance ministry official. This was B.K. Nehru, who single-handedly decided that we had to have the foreign exchange budgeting. Now, the licensing and foreign exchange budgeting together became quite fatal, and later, of course, the kind of more traditional arguments for protectionism got invoked, import substitution, and this, Nurse-Prebisch kind of arguments began to creep in. But the original intent was simply a very different one. It was not a protectionist intent under Nehru. So, in any case, we come forward, but once you domestically, you have shut out the competition through investment licensing, but now once you begin to shut also the foreign channel of imports, because once you introduce foreign exchange budgeting, importation became very difficult. License, basically you need an import license to import anything, and you began to then decide what goods will be allowed to be imported and what goods not be allowed to be imported. And import, of course, consumer goods were the first one to be banned. But also for intermediate inputs, etc., they became all a part of planning. So you have to do then this elaborate exercise that if you are going to invest in such and such machinery, if you are going to need to import the machinery, well, have I got enough foreign exchange? So go check with the finance ministry. Whether the finance ministry will allocate you the enough foreign exchange or not. It all became far more complicated, complex, and this is where then imports began to take a hit. During the 1950s, actually, at peak, imports in India were about 10% of the GDP. If you look at the peak, one of the peak years, they fell by 1970 to 4%. I mean, when economy grows even a little bit, it's rare that you see the import to GDP ratio declining. But in fact, not only it declined, but from the peak, actually, it went to below 0.5%. And 4% means, at 0%, it's autarky. I mean, so no trade. Right? So really, trade pretty much got out of it. One of the calamities of that was the quality of the product that suffered just enormously. Those of us who grew up during this period, those of us who saw the quality of the products in 60s and 70s know how poor the quality had turned. I mean, it's nice, interesting anecdote that I like to tell, because Jagdish Bhagwati sort of arrived in the early 1960s from Cambridge. And this was still, he was still, like every other Indian, was a socialist and was not a free trader. Sort of more kind of nationalist view, patriotic view. So he wrote to his mentor and teacher, Harry Johnson, who was a very eminent trade economist, perhaps would have been awarded a Nobel Prize if he had lived long enough. But he wrote to him that, dear Harry, I find the craze for the foreign goods quite disconcerting. That how much people really crave for those. So Harry Johnson was a very witty man. So he wrote back, said, dear Jagdish, if the quality of the paper on which your letter was written is any indication of the quality of the India-produced goods, the craze for the foreign goods seems to be quite rational to me. And that's, that was, I mean, I remember, we used to use these razor blades for shaving, and often this is very hazardous. It'll take off your skin. Likewise, there's the sharpeners we used. The lead would never, before the lead is sharper, the lead would break. So the quality of the fountain pens, we used to joke, that they're mostly fountains, not pens. But once the quality suffers in that manner, your ability to export also really simply goes away. Not that anybody gave any primacy to exports, but if there was a chance, it was gone with the quality, because in the world markets, but it also has general effect on the efficiency, because when you operate in the global economy, in the world markets, you got to compete against the very best. I mean, even in my own profession, when you are actually competing in globally, no matter how hard you work, we are working against you're having to compete against the top scholars of the world. So even if you're working 18 hours a day, you're barely kind of floating, you're barely surviving. But if you're in a protected market where there's no competition, then you can publish a few papers here and there in locally produced journals, get by. And it's the same, take a product, if you're really an export oriented, the economy is open. Even if you're import competing product, if the economy is open, foreign products are going to outcompete you if you don't deliver the kind of quality. So if there are any people old enough in the audience to have lived in pre-protection, pre-liberalization, post-liberalization, both, would know, how the quality of the products has really dramatically changed. Everything. In my early years when I would come back to India, there'd be so much demand from the relatives and everybody, and you hardly had any. As a student, I hardly had any money, but there'll be demands. Bring me this, bring me that. But after the opening up happened, it stopped completely. Nobody. Products arrived in. The iPhone now arrives in India before it arrives probably in America. So, is that that's a dramatic kind of difference that has taken place. But it also then changes the quality of production domestically. I think I'll give you one personal example that the first few years when I came back for visits here, I would buy these shirts from here because certainly on the whole they look decent and certainly they were less expensive. Perhaps also my family paid for it, so it was convenient for me. But generally after a few years I sort of would stop wearing them. But today actually most of my shirts I buy in India. The quality in India actually of the shirts is dramatically improved. It's world class. So you can get the world class quality here. So in any case, this whole licensing regime, import licensing, investment licensing. Also, we had then price controls. We had distribution controls. Again, if anybody remembers having to build a house or even repair a house, and you needed a few bags of cement, boy, it was an adventure to get that. First, you had to go and get some sort of permit, because cement was a controlled commodity. So you had to get a permit to get 5 bags of cement or 10 bags of cement, and then when you actually hauled that cement from the whatever warehouse or wherever you are picking from in a thela, and brought to your home, some inspector will invariably catch you to make sure with, oh, do you have the license or not? And then you pay up. On quality again, the telephone was a fantastic example. It's something I've used. We would first of all, getting telephone was very tough. You to stand in the queue for sometimes 5 years, 6 years. But then you got the telephone, but then there will be no dial tone. So because you have to then go and bribe your way to the, and that's a constant, that you have to constantly, every month or every 2 months or 3 months, the dial tone will be taken out. And you then go to the what was it called, the post and telegraph or something, this was before telecommunications was separated out, and you'll have to go and get those guys, give them some Diwali gift and all those that restored your dial tone. And I remember the time in the 1980s, Stephens, who was the telecommunications minister, so one time this member of parliament kind of got very agitated and said that what kind of phones you're supplying, half of the time you can't get the dial tone, and then even if you have the dial tone, you dial the number, you get the wrong number. It's a totally terrible service. So Stephens got up and says, the honorable member of parliament should understand, in a poor country like India, telephone is a luxury. And if the honorable member is not happy with this service, he can give it to me. I've got people who have been standing in the queue for 10 years. I'll give it to them. So, this was also our attitude towards towards governance and everything. This is where I started off, my pessimism in the 1980s about the pessimists and optimists. The anecdote joke I told you. It looked like it's not going to change, and suddenly something did change. Perhaps there was, underlying the process. Perhaps recognition was beginning to happen that that the whole system was not working. Businessmen were also complaining, of course, ceaselessly. But in the government, actually, particularly the bureaucratic level, it was beginning to be seen that things were not working. So some liberalization had begun to happen in 1980s in a piecemeal fashion. It's not very systematic, but certainly it happened. And there were certainly some enlightened bureaucrats during this period who wanted to actually liberalize the system, but of course without changing the policy itself, within the existing policy only limited liberalization could happen, and that's the sort of thing that happened through the 80s. Now politically, I think things do change. One thing I already described, that increasingly there is dissatisfaction within the country with the system not working very well, but then also, in addition, Soviet Union, after which India had modeled itself in 1950 when the planning was first launched. That was the model, except that we kind of modified it to make it more compatible with democracy. Soviet Union collapsed. So that was another impetus. And the third was that, the way I like to put it is that, when during those days, if you talk to many analysts in India, said, look, how South Korea has done so well, so first you say, how Singapore had done so well or Hong Kong had done so well. No, they are city states, they really don't count. So he said, well, Korea and Taiwan, so no, they're small, it doesn't apply to, what they have done doesn't apply to India. We are a very large country, and it couldn't work that way. But when China, which was even bigger than India in population, decided to actually change course under Deng Xiaoping, and ended up with a 10% growth, arguably, but certainly 7-8% by all measures during the 1980s. That, I think, made a big difference. That, wow, even China, which is the communist country, has gone to the somewhat pro-market model or more outward-oriented model, and it actually has produced results, I think. So intellectually, the case for what we were doing had weakened, and so we were also sort of ready. A lot of people say, oh, the World Bank and the IMF conditionality. In 1991, there was a balanced payments crisis, which served as the occasion to liberalize, and the view one view is that, well, this happened because the World Bank conditionality and IMF conditionality did it. Technically, you could argue that the first liberalization, 1991, was due to that, although it's more nuanced than that. The country was also ready, and moreover, certainly, country did not do all that IMF and the World Bank were actually wanting. So the country actually chose what it wanted to liberalize, what it did not want to liberalize, etc. But for sure, after the first structural adjustment loan, the IMF and the bank were gone. Meaning they gone in the sense that the clout was finished. India had recovered. The consolidation was already beginning to happen. Balance of the dollar, the foreign exchange reserve had begun to rise up. So it really didn't need any more loans. And I know this firsthand because 1993, April, for the second loan that the World Bank was going to come in to negotiate, I was on that team. So I know damn well, actually, very first hand that we went in, and Montek told us that the Prime Minister has decided now there's not going to be. I mean, our team was told that unless consumer goods imports are liberalized, loan is not going to be given. So we went and talked to Montek Ahluwalia at the time. He was the finance secretary, and he said, well, there are elections happening in Madhya Pradesh, Rajasthan, and there were 3 states, and Prime Minister is not going to do anything more now, and that was that. But at the end of the day, the World Bank gave that loan, saying that, oh, well, based on what India has already done, we can give the loan. I mean, by that time, it is basically the bank that wanted to be engaged with India, not the other way around. So that's the history. And so in this sense, I think India really owned its own liberalization. Liberalization could have stopped after these first tranche. The really, 91, 92 liberalization. After that, India was in the driving seat for sure, 100%. So they could have chosen not to, but they continued. I mean, this is when the telecommunications was first, the mobile telephone, the private guys were given entry into this. They called it the value-added service, but the mobile telephones were introduced during this period through the private sector entry. And in the 4 metros, actually, the service was introduced very successfully. It did well. In the other 18 circles that they tried to put, they were not very successful. That, seriously speaking, the remaining 18 circles could become truly effective only after Vajpayee's 1999 reform of the new telecom policy. And that, of course, if one wants to see a link between the reforms and the response to the reforms, telecommunications is really the poster boy case for that. As late as 1999 or 98, you got about 3 telephones, including the fixed line and the mobile, 3 telephones per 100. So that tele density is really still, today we think that, it all happened during the 1990s, but the real thing happened really in the 2000s. And then, of course, it was a dramatic, after the new telecom policy was put in place, it was just no looking back. And we went from, today, we went from, well, 91, of course, was this, it was 5 million telephones altogether after 110 years of telephone having been introduced in the country. But now we are about 1 billion telephones. I haven't actually checked the latest figures, but we are close to there, close to that. So anyway, at the end of the day, the real battle was won through liberalization. Now, it should be clear, a lot of people say, oh, you want to introduce this Thatcherite, Reaganite kind of economics and all. But that's not really where we are. That's really, if you think into, we are far from, when Reagan came or when Thatcher came, these were already market economies. They were already, certainly centrist, let's say, or left of center. But so where we started, if the center was here, we were right here. Very, very far to the left. This is my left, not yours. And all we are talking about is, come a bit closer to the center. We have done some movement, but still perhaps not far enough. But it's not Reaganite or Thatcherite here. The government in India will always remain involved. It should remain involved. A lot of the things, anyway, the private sector cannot do, should not do. And so participate. So the role of the government is very much there. But what the growth does. So here is finally, I'll close the circle. and try to conclude quickly in the next 5 to 7 minutes. So the way growth really helped, I think, in combating poverty is it's a two-pronged strategy. One, growth by itself pulls people into gainful employment. It creates jobs. It also raises wages. And you can see the evidence for both, particularly the wages have been pulled up. And that, of course, helps raise incomes of those who are at the bottom. And that in turn allows them to access not only good food and clothing and shelter, but it also allows them to access education and health that are provided maybe privately or even publicly. Even the accessibility requires accessing even publicly provided services many times. Accessing them requires some minimal income. Your public health center may be located in the village next door. You need at least some money to be able to take the bus and go to the village next door. So even accessing requires some bit of income, but if you're trying to access quality education or quality health, surely income helps. But the other way, of course, growth helps is that it really multiplies your revenues. 1991, when people complain, or early 1990s when Manmohan Singh was the Prime Minister, he would constantly complain there is not enough revenues. So in effect, the social programs actually didn't do very well during that period, precisely because there were not enough revenues. Fiscal consolidation was on, so they had to really cut expenditures, restore the fiscal health. But that of course means that often is the current expenditures that are that get cut, and that's sort of thing that happen. Now, once the growth kicked in at 8% on the average for a whole decade, revenues really multiplied, and that of course allows you to then also introduce a vast number of social programs. We could introduce NREGA, we could introduce the Food Security Act, but even before the Food Security Act, you had the PDS expanding, as well as, very importantly, Sarv Shiksha Abhiyan that was launched under Atal Bihari Vajpayee, but eventually the constitutional amendment was also introduced then, but the implementing legislation still had to wait because not enough resources. And it was ultimately in 2009 that the Right to Education Act was passed. Okay, so that's roughly the how I see the economy, how over the last 60 years has evolved, and at least my sort of view how the reduction in poverty has happened during this period. What happens? I think last 2 years of the UPA government, growth really got scuttled. I have taken the view that it was largely policy generated. A lot of the paralysis came in, a lot of the projects were held up, and that immediately impacted actually the ability to finance social expenditures. They did take hit. I mean, they didn't decline, but they certainly couldn't expand in the way they could be expanded in the prior 10 years. What the new government has done is initially ended the paralysis or to a very substantial degree. Environmental clearances have begun to move faster. Also, a lot of the governance-related issue, ease of doing business kind of issues, they are being tackled, have been tackled. Some more opening up has happened. You saw the defense sector opened up for 26% to foreign investment. You saw the insurance sector opening up happening, and most recently in coal and mining, you had the new legislation come in. Land acquisition, of course, is still being debated, currently under the ordinance, of course. But that's where we're going. The growth certainly has accelerated. There are issues you can discuss about the new growth series, etc. But for the year 14-15, that's the new series is all you got, which is about, according to which growth rate for 14-15 is 7.4%. So certainly the optimism is generally back. Today, Moody's also raised the rating, so there's a big news for the government. So I think outlook certainly looks a lot more promising and optimistic. Let me stop there. Thank you. Could take 2 or 3 questions. We can take 2 or 3 questions.
Couple of questions.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So, yeah. So, couple of questions. Okay. I will prefer some questions from students. Okay. Go ahead. Yeah.
Uh, Professor Pangaria, thank you so much for your lecture. You mentioned about the importance of state having enough revenue to invest in social infrastructure. Now, my question is that even if the state has a lot of revenue, is Manrega and Food Security Act the right method to employ people or provide them food? I mean, if despite having a lot of economic growth, which is a prerequisite to generate revenue, you still want somebody in the rural area to go and dig trenches to be usefully employed, rather than being employed in a close by factory, so that he can go and buy his own food and not depend on the state for a dole to be given. So don't you think that even if the state has a lot of revenue, there are certain things which is not the right method to provide employment or food to people? Thank you.
I think I have to outsource that question to Jean. Sorry. No, I didn't say we started. No, no. Why? I'm sorry you interpret what I said that way. I mean, history is very clear. We here meant India. I'm not, I'm not speaking for any government right now. We means India. I mean, I said we also for the 60s and 70s when I had nothing to do with the policy, Ram. No, that credit is 100% yours. I mean, you are sitting in here. I mean, if it's a matter of, giving credit to some specific entity while you are sitting in the audience, how dare I do anything like making a claim for myself? That's your crowning achievement. 100% your crowning achievement, which is why I said I'll outsource the question to you. I've given the answer. That was the answer.
Okay, there's a question from one of
good
the students.
Good evening, sir. Sir, I'm Yashika, pursuing Masters in Development Economics. So my question is more general, but one of my genuine concerns. So when you talk about growth matters, yes, it does. But and the other viewpoint that we all know, they talk about redistribution, and we talk about higher growth and then trickle down. So can we not have practically a policy mix and like stop the extremist two positions and really come to an economic solution, like having a balanced approach, having growth and equitable like together?
Where are you getting this?
Yeah.
We do have the mix. We do have the mix. Do we not have Narega? Does Jean not have Narega? Does Jean not have Food Security Act? I mean, we do have, in our pluralistic society, you think you can really lean on one side? I mean, pure redistribution you cannot, because you have got to have the cake, the pie growing to really do effective redistribution. So pure redistribution will not work. Pure growth could work, but nobody in our pluralistic society actually would have just pure growth. I mean, even those who are the direct first beneficiaries of this growth in reaping the returns, etc. None actually. I mean, do you come across anybody in India who says growth is only growth? Maybe Surjit Bhalla.
Yes, Bosdeep. Yeah.
Hello, sir. I'm student.
So we take
student
you
from
and we take one more.
Okay.
Then I'm
yeah.
hungry. I need
Yeah,
food.
yeah.
student of this particular university. I have two questions for you.
One.
Oh, one.
You are allowed only
Okay.
one.
Uh-huh.
One, then the present policy scenario. Then it's like you're like you're defending the trickle down effect and everything like that. My question is
Defending trickle down.
just saying that we should have growth at the upper part and it will come to the poor eventually. This is the point.
Who says that? Did you hear me say that? No. I said growth pulls people up. I don't think it's trickle down. It's a very powerful effect. When economy grows at 8 or 9%, really it creates higher wages. It creates employment opportunities, and so it's not a trickle down. I think of it as a pull-up effect.
But my question was a little bit different from this. My question was that with the present land acquisition bill, if I can ask you in that, that if we are talking about being the recent immense changes in those things, then no one speaks about the landless laborers, what will happen to them, because many of the agriculture workers basically landless. So if we say that the land will be given on a big good amounts, that will be given to the landowners, but there's a more than 50% of the persons who are dependent on agriculture are basically landless laborers. So even we have a good growth of 8 or 9%, and even if we compensate the landowners by a good amount, say 4 times the value of their land, then who will take care of those landless labor? Will they go, at least if we say for the period when the growth won't come to them, or when at least with the time period when the jobs will not be created for the 3-4 years, 4-5 years. So what is the policy for those people?
No. Look, so the two separate things you should think about. One, about 49% of the workforce today is in agriculture. So what happens in agriculture matters a lot as far as the poor are concerned. Also, in fact, it is stronger than that, because 49%, this is 11-12 and NSS figures. So 11-12 got 49% of the workforce in agriculture, which produces which produced in that year only 14% of the GDP. So you know that 49% relying on an income which is only 14% of the GDP. You know immediately that a lot of the very poor people are sitting there. So what happens to agriculture is extremely important. So you need the agricultural wages to rise. And when you said, what happens in the 3-4 years, that's precisely the point, that if you are going to bring immediate relief to the poor, doing good things in agriculture, of course, is incredibly important. Now, there also has to be a strategy for the economic transformation. We could, keep those 49% continuously forever there. But that's not the strategy for development. You also need transformation to happen. How did Korea and Taiwan really manage to transform so completely, so dramatically? Korea and Taiwan in 1950s look no different than India, in terms of living standards and all. But how do they transform themselves within 20 years? Manufacturing grows, and it's a labor-intensive manufacturing that grows very rapidly, pulls the workforce out of agriculture into manufacturing. That raises wages in agriculture simultaneously. So if you look at the wages in Korea, for 2 decades they rise about 9% a year in real terms. That, of course, is a powerful poverty reduction tool by itself. I mean, in those days they didn't talk too much about social programs. Education they did, of course, but in terms of the other social programs, they came much later. I mean, but the transformation at the end of the day you need. So people ultimately, in the longer run, you do need the workers to move out of agriculture into manufacturing and services jobs. You don't want to leave this population continuously in that state. In the end, weather does happen, and in spite of whatever resources we might be able to pull together to help the farmers, when this kind of rain happens, hailstorm happen, and such a vast number of people actually are ruined, even the government's ability is challenged then. So for a longer run, you need the transformation to happen. How is the transformation going to happen? Now, also consider some of the statistics. And so, some of you, I'm sure, know these data figures and all. So please, I'm not asking those who already know. I'm asking this only to those who do not know, so I want you to guess. What proportion of land is currently used in things like housing, industry, infrastructure, etc.? Meaning not agriculture. I'll also ask that, how much of agriculture, how much of the land is under agriculture. But forget that. That's not why I'm asking. I'm asking, this building is built on some land, and factories are built on some land, and infrastructure is built on some land and all. What proportion of land is being used for, of our total land area is being used for that? Sorry? Less than 10%. 25 to 30%. Huh? 80%. Okay. Any other numbers? So how many think that it's somewhere around 25%? How many? People are shy. wanted to raise their hands. How many think it's 80%? No, even the one
Nobody.
that gave the answer is not up. It's 8%. And you know, from 97, 98 to now, it has risen from 7% to 8%. And within agriculture, the net area sown has declined by 0.4 percentage points. But if you take the gross area sown, which takes into account multiple cropping, then actually you have a 2 percentage point increase. And in fact, even that 0.4 percentage point that you're talking about, the net area sown decline, you'll find most of it in the fallow land, because a lot of the people are now beginning to migrate into non-farm activities. But because of the land rules, laws, etc., that exist, both leasing and sales, they neither can want to sell it, nor they feel that it is safe to lease it, so it sits fallow. So I think, you know, we are not talking about taking away out of agriculture big chunks of land. In another 10 years, it will go maybe from 8 to 9 if the process kind of progresses in the way it has progresses in the past. So
Okay,
one last one, I had agreed. So
Good evening, sir. My name is Manish. I'm a final year student of Development Economics from South Asian University. So my question is, what is the agenda of Niti Aayog and how is it going to be different from Planning Commission?
this one I wish I could outsource. I think the Planning Commission was largely kind of organized around the 5-year plans. Currently, we are still completing the 12th 5-year plan, and so there's 2 years left. So we would do the midterm appraisal. We are actually currently doing the midterm appraisal of the 12th 5-year plan, and for the next 2 years, so we'll complete that. The government has to take a call, meaning here that Prime Minister really, because he's the chairman of Niti Aayog, as to in what form he wishes the planning to continue, whether it's going to be 5-year plans or a strategic plan or grassroots planning. But that's a call that the Prime Minister will have to take. In the meantime, one thing that is emerging, and we have to see what form it takes, is that our interface with the states is changing very dramatically. You know, the old Planning Commission was heavily into allocating funds, revenues and all, right? And it financed their plans, the states' plans, etc. So it really controlled a lot of money. We are not doing that very much. So, you know, there is a small fund of by the government standards, small, 20,000 crores have been, but how that money is to be spent anyway, the criteria have not been determined yet, but it's certainly not Niti Aayog's money to distribute to the states. The government will have to take a view on that. So in effect, our interface with the states now is very different. It's going to be very different. So we are supposed to be some sort of, you know, official consulting firm for the, if you will, for the state governments. So, you know, if the state governments have issues of policy, of programs, etc., on which they need our advice, they could come to us. We have internal expertise, but we also can go and seek, if our internal expertise is not good enough, then we go and seek from outside. Help states connect to wherever the best expertise might be available. So that's sort of one of the activities that's going to expand quite a bit. Will also become the depository for things like best practices in various areas. So that, you know, the idea is simply that good policies try to kind of disseminate them, have them diffuse to all the states. So it's going to turn much more into a think tank kind of institution than it previously was. So that's the sort of rough answer at this stage. All right, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, friends, we had a wonderful day, and the talk was very exciting, I must say. This is a wonderful end to the first day of our conference, and I profusely thank Arvind to have agreed to come here and give this opportunity to us. As a token of our appreciation, I will request our president And this is a small memento. This we want to give you from the university. No, this is nothing valuable. This is.
Then why should I have it? But your flash never flashed.
Okay, so now it is time for dinner. All the invitees are requested to go to Hotel Ashok, Friendship Lounge on the 3rd floor. So we'll reassemble there for dinner. So thank you very much.